Mr. Brown, I've got quite a lot of questions for you, and I'm afraid that I haven't been able to order them very well, so I'm going to be dotting around a bit. You were discussing the medical assessment procedure for for applications coming onto the scheme, and you talked about the fact that when it's effectively 1-1 between the first two medical assessors, you go to a third. Does the third assessor have sight of the decisions of the first two, or do they review the application blind?
Blind.
As a matter of fact, is it correct that the scheme does not recognise comorbidities as a consequence of HIV? And by that I mean the infections that somebody might suffer as a consequence of having HIV. So is that so? There's effectively no sort of special category mechanism for somebody with HIV who has consequential infections.
That not to my knowledge. No, that isn't part of the EAP scheme.
Again, going back now to the appeal panel, does an HIV specialist sit on the appeal panel, to your knowledge?
Yes.
So there is an HIV clinician on the independent appeal panel?
That, to my knowledge, yes. Has any discussion, has there been any discussion about whether IBS might be asked to administer the compensation framework that's being contemplated? Yes.
There has been a discussion about that?
Yes.
And is that a work in progress?
Only in that, as we know who the beneficiaries are, if a compensation framework is agreed and established, it would, and we know the bank accounts, if not as well as the individuals, it would seem sensible for us to be involved in that. The detailed specification of that I do not have, and ultimately the department might decide to give it to somebody else or do it themselves. But I would imagine that it would be EAPS.
I was asking you questions about the anti-D eligibility criteria, if I can put it that way, the difference between the intravenous and the intramuscular. Has EAPS had any information about subcutaneous anti-D procedures?
I would need, on that level of clinical detail, I would have to revert to the inquiry. Apologies, I don't have that to hand.
And the advice that the inquiry has received in relation to anti-D came from Dr. Patricia Hewitt, is that correct?
Yes.
And you've provided that advice to the inquiry.
Yes.
Is that advice going to be published more widely than on the website or anything of that nature?
Yes, it's my understanding that will be widely published on our website as well as to the inquiry.
A question arising out of the way I put a question to you when I was asking you questions about the clinicians assessing applications coming onto the scheme. And I suggested to you that in circumstances where there were no medical records, what they were doing was adopting a clinical plausibility test, i.e. is it plausible that this person could have undergone this procedure? Is it plausible that if this person underwent this procedure, they would have required blood or blood products?
Yes.
The question is it right? Is that the test they're applying, or are they applying the balance of probabilities test?
Well, they're applying a balance probability test that the individual undertook that procedure, and it was that procedure which resulted in the infection.
And are they seeing all of the evidence available in support of the application?
Absolutely. Every piece of evidence that is submitted is provided. At times it can be quite extensive for them, but yes, all statements, anything that's provided, it's to help them reach their decision.
And another question arising out of the way that I put something to you, okay. I suggested to you that, or I put a question to you which said that income top-up payments are available to the bereaved community, to which you said yes. I just wanted to clarify with you that in fact income top-up support payments are available to bereaved partners and spouses.
Bereaved partners and spouses, yes.
Sorry, I'm getting myself in a muddle now. Right. Does EBS keep a watching brief on what's going on in the other schemes in the other devolved nations?
I mean, we do at a working level. Recognising that the EBS team is probably bigger than the other devolved schemes. So we are aware of what they are doing, and sometimes that can form the sort of the discussions that we have with the policy officials.
Is it right that I think you told us that EBS has no information on whether or not a beneficiary has haemophilia or their route of infection, because that data wasn't shared by the Alliance House organisation?
That's right.
Would you hold that data in relation to beneficiaries who have made applications since coming on to the scheme? So for somebody that's made an application for a discretionary top-up or something of that kind?
If a beneficiary declared that as part of their submission, it would be held within their record, but it isn't a piece of information that we specifically seek and require from every single applicant.
Do you think that that actually might be beneficial to EBS to understand that basic data on their beneficiaries in order to help them understand their beneficiary community better?
It's certainly something we can consider, but equally we also need to respect beneficiaries who are not keen on revealing every aspect of their medical history and all of their conditions to us, which aren't going to directly impact the decision or the amount of the payment that we make. But it is, I'll certainly take that one away and explore it. But we need to be mindful that we're supporting a broad community.
Another question on information. Does EBS keep a record of the mortality rates within the beneficiary group? We
do. I mean, clearly, if there's any change in circumstances, that information is reported to us. That information is held in EBS.
But presumably, given what you've told us, you wouldn't be able to say how many people that have been infected by haemophilia or by transfusion had died, but we would know the headline figure.
That's right,
how many of your beneficiaries have died.
It's not a key reporting measure that we are reporting on to the department, but we will hold that information. Yes.
So, and then the next question was: are those figures provided to the Department of Health and Social Care? And the answer to that is no, not routinely.
No.
But if they ask for them, you would give it to them.
Yes.
Yes. I've had quite a lot of detailed questions about the focus review group, how people are invited, who is invited, who's allowed to attend, the minutes, and so on. Given what you've told us about what you know about it, I suspect we've reached the limits of your knowledge about those matters. That perhaps this is just to say we might pick those up in a further Rule 9.
Sure.
So those that attend and deal with that can answer those detailed questions. Sorry. I think I've got one set of... Oh, here we go. Are you aware, are you aware as to whether some beneficiaries were reluctant to transfer personal information to EBS? Is that something that you were ever made aware of?
No, not at all. Was certainly not brought to my attention in terms of any reluctance in terms of if anything from the APPG meetings that I attended, the sense I was left with, certainly from the beneficiaries that I spoke to personally, they were looking forward to the Alliance House organisations being dissolved and EBS being established. And
are you aware of any difficulties during the early setting up meetings of EBS about particular beneficiaries being invited to attend, or being not being allowed to attend?
Not to my knowledge. That would be news to me. I would certainly have, the whole basis of the way in which we have set up EBS is to be open and transparent and fair. So I can't imagine any meeting or session that we had that a beneficiary couldn't be invited to. So that's nothing that's come to my attention.
I think that the question was in relation to setting up meetings before EBS, before they were beneficiaries of EBS. So that at that stage they would have been beneficiaries of the Alliance House organisations.
All right.
Does EBS have a system where the data that you've given us on applications gives us data on both accepted applications, declined applications, and pending further information applications? So is that data you keep, that
Yes.
some applications are marked as pending, are they?
Yes.
And then just turning to the question of the one-off lump sum payment for the bereaved, and the requirement to show that the HIV infection or HCV infection or treatment contributed to the death.
Yes.
To what extent does EBS require that either HCV or HIV is specifically recorded on the death certificate?
Certainly, if it is recorded, it enables a far swifter confirmation to be reached, and payment to be made. So it's not an absolute requirement. I mean, we can't require what is put onto the death certificate. But where it isn't stated, it may mean that whether it's information from coroners or from or other medical records may need to be provided that was the cause.
And is this fair, that if HIV or HCV is recorded on the death certificate, then that's very easy for the EBS to process?
Yes.
If more common related HIV or HCV conditions are recorded on the death certificate, so for example somebody that suffers HCV liver disease, then again that's fairly straightforward for EBS to make the link between the death
yeah.
and the infection. How about where it's more removed than that? So, for example, in the case of an extrahepatic manifestation of HCV, for example, kidney disease, is there what's the process? What's the approach that EBS takes in relation to that?
Well, in that scenario, we would work with the bereaved to see if they could provide something else. We're not restrictive in terms of you have to provide. We obviously need to have, because you've seen the basis of how we determine entitlement. So we can't just take an individual's word that the cause of death meets the criteria. But as long as we have some evidence, and that can be as broad as the individual is able to get us, that will enable us to make the payment. And that's when I said sometimes that can take a while, and we do acknowledge the inconvenience and the distress as well that causes individuals, and that's why when we finally get the missing piece of information, we'll make a same-day payment.
And just 2 points on that. The guidance we didn't look at in any detail, but the guidance on that point requires, first of all, the death certificate, but then there's an opportunity for supporting clinical information from a GP or for another clinician to make the link between the HIV, HCV, and the death.
Yes.
That's right. And is that generally accepted by?
My understanding is that it's generally accepted. I've not had any. I've had any complaints escalated in terms of where we've refused on that basis, and so to my knowledge, it's generally accepted. As I mentioned before, our role as EBS scheme administrators isn't at all to be the gatekeepers and prevent money being paid out that beneficiaries or the bereaved are entitled to, but we do have to have sufficient evidence to support that the payments we make. We are audited as well. This is public money that's paid out, and as long as we've got some information, then we'll make the payments.
And then last question, again relating to that, is on such applications, can you get assistance from your clinicians to help you to assess the causation between the death and the infection? Yes,
in that scenario, if we were, those medical advisors are freelance contractors to us, so they will, they will charge and for the time that they spend on this work, and we would refer to them in that instance.
So those are the questions that I'm going to ask from the call participants.
Yes, just one matter which I want to ask you about. Could we have a look again at WITN 4688006? And if we look at the definition in 1.4 of a secondary beneficiary, it's someone who is a bereaved partner or spouse or a dependent child of a primary beneficiary. Now, you were involved in, at least as a listening participant, in the discussions which set up EBS.
Yes, sir.
Did anyone draw attention to or consider that when the Macfarlane Trust was first set up, its deed provided for not only bereaved partners and spouses, but bereaved parents? Did anyone raise that point? Do you remember?
I don't recall that point being raised at all.
So does it follow you can't help why, although that was part of that scheme in the definition of those who could be beneficiaries, when it came to EBS and the discussions, it wasn't on the list?
I certainly don't recall that specifically being raised as a key element of the scheme, and therefore, when we were looking and comparing the proposed at that time EBS and the Alliance House schemes, I don't recall that item being flagged as something that needed to be addressed.
Is there anything you would like to add?
Thank you, Ms. Scott. Just a final statement, really. While I sit here in front of the inquiry, I just want to acknowledge that I can't imagine the suffering that the beneficiaries have encountered in the past and may continue in the future. But what I can assure everyone and this inquiry is that the EVES team are absolutely dedicated. They are accessible and want to help people as much as they possibly can within the scope that we have. I also want to reassure beneficiaries that we will continue to make payments that we're directed to make without any hiccups, and the team are busy now working hard to get the parity payments made, and the first batch of those will be made before the end of July, and we'll work through those as quickly as we can.
Well, can I, for my part, thank you very much for giving us such a wealth of information about how the scheme was administered, not just in the evidence you've given orally today, but in your witness statement at some length, which is available, will be available after your evidence is put up on the website. And thank you also for making it clear, really, some of the limitations that you've had, in the sense that you are an administrator and not making the policy, even though you may have an influence on it. Although I take note of the fact that on a personal level, very early on in your evidence, you said you were almost lost for words, really, to describe how individuals were treated. And that, I hope, is the approach which you have taken throughout. So thank you very much for your assistance.
Thank you, sir.
So we're back this afternoon at 2:30 with Mr. Hancock and Mr. Vinal.
Yes. So 2:30 for our next two witnesses.